I would first like to say how excited I am to be speaking with Alexandra Pringle. You heard the short introduction there, and I'm sure she needs no introduction to this audience, but she's had a long and storied career in publishing, and correct me if I'm wrong. I understand you began with an arts magazine before you were editor-in-chief of Virago Press, and then moved on to Hamish Hamilton. You had a short stint as a literary agent before going on to Bloomsbury, where you were editor and editor-in-chief, and are now moving on to better pastures. So I think, it's very exciting for us to get this backstage look at the publishing and the making of literary stars, which is a sort of romantic concept for all writers and readers, I think. And so I was, going to ask you a little bit about how you recognize these stars when you see them, because you clearly have published writers who have gone on to win the Nobel Prize, the Women's Prize in Fiction, and many others. But I have to think, when you came across them, they were aspiring writers like anyone else. So what is it on the page or off the page that made you sit up and think, this is someone I'm going to champion for the long haul? For clearly, you do champion people for the long haul. Can you tell us something about that?
Thank you. It's really lovely to be here. Can you hear me? It's very noisy up here. Does he hear? Yeah. Okay, so it's a very difficult thing to describe it. There is no method of understanding what it is about a book, and there's sadly no script written for you as an editor. And I think that all an editor ever has is what is inside of themselves. It's their own taste. And other people in publishing companies kind of can't bear that. And it means that editors are difficult people, and they are often renegade people. I think they're often much closer to writers in their feelings and their imagination and the way they go about their work than they are close to their other colleagues who do other very important bits of that business. Mm-hmm. And so it's a really mysterious and mercurial thing. And what you have is how you respond when you read a manuscript. And in talking about that, I'm talking most of all about fiction, mm-hmm. because I think nonfiction is different, and nonfiction is usually bought on a synopsis and a couple of chapters, and you understand what the subject is and whether the person has that expertise, and also importantly whether they write well. But fiction is entirely subjective, and so for all that people will want to understand how it can be sold, you can't understand. Nobody can understand that process. And so when you read a book, you have this visceral thing on the page, and it's to do with a combination of many different things. It's to do with the way that the writer speaks to you, the language that the writer uses, the way they construct the sentences, if it is in a way a music to you in your inner ear. But it's also the story that they're telling, how they're telling it, and whether the story is important to you personally. And I have a very particular thing that when I'm reading a manuscript, if I am always thinking, I want to give this to this person or that person, and that happens to me, if I do that in the process of reading it, then I feel that there is a magic there. That means that this book should be taken out further than yourself. But there really isn't much sense in it. So, and I think that publishers are forever trying to make out that we know what we're doing. And it's a bit like Colin McCann was talking about writing as a novelist, and he said, as a novelist, you don't know what you're mm-hmm. doing. And I would say, as an editor, you don't know what you're doing. You are just responding. But then you have to take it out into the world. So you have to have a very prolonged energy and a kind of stubbornness that will mean that you will take that book, and it's not out into the general world, first of all, it's out into the world of the company you work in. Persuading the people that you work with that this book is important and that it's worth doing. And sometimes it's an easy job and everybody falls in love with the book alongside you, and sometimes it isn't. And the weird thing is that the books that become the kind of million copy bestsellers are not necessarily the books that your colleagues agree with you about.
Well, that has to be great validation. And what if I may, I think what I hear you say is that publishers, like all readers, have kind of an intimate reaction to what they're reading. And so it's a lot of personal taste that influences your decision. Just the same way as a reader might pick up a book at a bookstore and decide whether they're going to keep with it or, you know, discard it or recommend it to other people, right? Would that be fair? And that actually, I do want to ask you about the authors you've had a difficult time convincing your colleagues about. But before we go to that, I was, you know, that brings up a point about just the fact that there's so much personal taste in what we call gatekeeping in publishing. And we've talked about this yesterday, and you're actually remarkable in the fact that you have, through your career, published writers from all over the world, and you have a strong interest in kind of presenting stories that may not be typical to your you know, immediate world or those of your immediate readers. So what is it that you think, with all this talk about diversity and publishing, where do you think we're at? What do you think is going well? And what would you like to see happen?
Well, diversity in publishing is probably the most important thing that has happened. The fact that people are taking notice of it and working towards it. And that really came out of the Black Lives Matter movement. So it was incredibly recent that people started talking about it seriously. As you said, I have always published from around the world, but that's been something that, again, it sounds silly, but it's been an instinctual thing with me, because it's been about my own interests. And I've said this many times, but the book that changed everything for me, which I read when I was 13 or 14, was Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. And it was in the reading of that book that my world shifted on its axis, and I realized that there were so many different stories in the world and so many different histories, and how important and how moving they are. And that changed the way that I read. And from then on, I mean, I've always been a reader. And I remember the great publisher Sonny Mehta, who died sadly just before lockdown and ran Knopf in America. And he said, what we do as publishers is we just read all the time. And that's what I always did. I was, in fact, an academic failure. And I did very badly at school, but I read all the time. And that moment of reading that book, Things Fall Apart, and then when I was at college, I wrote an extended essay on the effects of colonization on various writers, and it was Conrad, it was Achebe, and it was Joyce Carey. And it was that thing of trying to explore these narratives and histories through fiction and what that does to you. And I think it also just came out of my personal background, although I was not aware of it being that at all. That my mother came from Morocco, though she pretended that she didn't. My father came from Scotland, and I grew up thinking I was entirely English, but of course I wasn't. And I think these things inform you and you don't know until you're much further down your life. And you look at it and you think, maybe this is something to do with it. So I've always loved stories from outside of Britain, but I've also been incredibly interested in how people use the English language in such different ways, and that there is no received English, really. And that what is wonderful about English is it's the most elastic language in the world. And a bit like the way that Shakespeare is the most elastic playwright in the world, and that he can be turned on his head and turned inside out and dressed up and dressed down. And he's so good that something new comes out. And that's what the English language is like. And I've always just been enthralled by that. And so I think that's just guided my way of publishing. But of course, the problem with publishing in Britain, probably more than in America, which I think was and is probably more diverse, is that it's not just what you publish, it's who you are as publishers. And if I think back over my career as a publisher, it's really shameful to think that it's been absolutely full of white, middle class, but women. That's the good thing, is it's been a fantastic profession for women. And so women's voices have been attended to, certainly in the last 20, 30 years. But publishing needs to be turned inside out, and that has to happen, and that's a slow process, because to become an editor in particular, it's a very long, slow growth. It takes many years to become an editor, and so it's going to be many years before the actual constituency of publishing companies changes. And I worry that at the moment there's a lot of lip service being paid, and quite rightly the publishing programs are changing, but I think often it's about themes rather than about art and about what the books are. And I think that it's really important that that is attended to, and that it is absolutely possible to publish books that tell you important things, but they often can be told best in the subtlest of ways. And I think quite a lot of the publishing that goes on is a little bit schematic, and it's saying, oh, this is about this topic, and therefore it needs to be published, as opposed to, is this a fine and important novel? Is this a beautiful novel? And we need to listen carefully to this novel.
That's a beautiful thought. I do agree with you that, it seems like diversity is often thematic. So for instance, somebody will say, oh, we've done too many Indian novels, it's time to do one from Africa or something like that. So you're very right. I mean, to talk about how we need to look at stories on their own merit, and still manage to be diverse. And I'm guessing you're proposing that publishing in itself needs to be a more diverse industry for that to happen. And it's also interesting you talk about women being, a lot of publishers and editors and literary agents. And throughout the publishing chain, there's a lot of women. And you started out, with Margaret Atwood, and you published her very early on, and she is one of your writers. So you do have a strong feminist focus. Would I be right in saying that?
Well, I started my career at Virago Press,
right.
So I couldn't not be, really. So I was 24, I think, when I joined Virago, and I was the fourth person. So Virago was then a tiny, independent, feminist publishing company. It was one of only, I think, 3 at the time, and it was very quickly the biggest one. And it became the biggest one because of a series called the Virago Modern Classics, which was reclaiming voices that had disappeared, women's voices, over the years. And if you look at the canon of literature that people certainly studied at that point in universities, there were maybe 2 or 3 women, and we all know who they were. And women's voices had been silenced. And Virago did an extraordinary job. And I was incredibly lucky to join Virago at that early time. And we felt that we weren't just publishing books, we felt that we were changing the world. And I think Virago did change the culture. And so that has always been, I was actually brought up by a mother who was feminist, though I don't think she ever called herself that, but she was certainly the strong one in my family, and taught that independence and financial independence for women is important. And she gave me so many of the books that we published at Virago later.
Wow.
So in a way, again, my feminism was part of me from when I was very young. And then it became a more intellectual exercise as I got older. And certainly it's never, ever not been part of my publishing life, because I think that's just who I am. It's what I am. And, you know, people say to me, was it difficult being a woman in the publishing industry? But my first 12 years were working in a feminist company. It wasn't that wasn't difficult. It was bloody difficult in lots of ways, but that side of it wasn't difficult.
And what do you think about the state of publishing now? You know, in general, do you think women are published at the same rate as men are? Do you think they're getting the awards as often as men are? Is that?
Do you know, I don't know what the statistics are. I think there is a huge change from the days, from the 1980s, when there was this band of men who were Martin Amis, Julian Barnes, Ian McEwan, Salman Rushdie, and they were all friends, and they were all the most powerful people. They were the big writers that everyone knew about. And I think we have a really different landscape now. And in Britain, the Women's Prize did a huge amount to shift that. And just as when Virago was founded and people said, oh, what is the need for such a thing? When the Women's Prize was founded, so many people wrote in the press, why do we need this? And this is discrimination. And it was absolutely clear that it was needed. And the culture has shifted. There's always more work to be done. Always there is. It would be interesting, I mean, those, you know, the kind of deep dive into how many books by women are reviewed and how many women win prizes and so on, it hasn't been done, I think, recently. But when the Women's Prize was set up, there was a deep dive into the Booker Prize, and it was absolutely shocking how few women had even got onto the shortlist, let alone won the prize. But yeah, the great thing about the world is it does change, and in some things it gets better. And certainly within the publishing industry, I think women make much better publishers than men on the whole. And one of the very ordinary reasons for that is that women are used to doing a million different things in their lives. And to be a good publisher, you have to do a million different things at the same time. You have to work on the books that are being published now, the ones that are coming out in a month's time, the ones that are going to be published in a year's time, 2 years' time. You have to have your brain in a million different places. And as an editor, you're not just working on the text, you're working on getting that book out into the world. So you're a one-person publicist and salesperson, as well as a person who is working hand in hand with the author to help them make it the best book it can be.
It sounds a lot like a mom.
Yeah, exactly.
So can you tell us, you know, about the writers that you found, one or two stories perhaps, about interesting writers that you discovered. You certainly have a lot of them, but perhaps a story or two where you were proven right in the long run.
Well, for me, what I have loved is if I've had the chance to publish someone over a very long period of time. And when it comes to fiction, particularly in literary fiction, no writer has a consistent career, and or very, very few do. It's a long haul, and it has ups and downs. And also, as an editor, you don't necessarily love every book in the same way, because each book is so different. And there are some books that you feel more passionately about, or that you feel you can get out into the world with a bigger splash. But it's wonderful when you meet a writer when they're sort of, in a way, still a child. And so there are some that I've worked with for many, many years. One of them is a novelist called Esther Freud, who I took on with her first novel, Hideous Kinky. And I've worked with her ever since, and she joined me when I was at Hamish Hamilton, went with me when I was an agent, then came with me to Bloomsbury. And then another writer who I met, who was still a student, is Kamala Shamsi, the writer from Pakistan. And it was a completely strange fluke. But I think in a way we were kind of fated for each other. I was invited to a workshop in a university in upstate New York. And I call myself a travel tart. I love traveling so much that if somebody says, come somewhere, I say, yes, please. So I went to this university I'd never heard of, and I was given a pile of stories. And I have to say, they were pretty much all terrible. They were plodding Raymond Carver look-alike stories. But there was one shimmering little jewel of a story in the middle of this pile about a boy flying a kite on a roof in Pakistan. And I basically just talked about this story because I didn't really have anything to say about the others. And the indescribably shy young woman who wrote the story came up to me afterwards and she said, I'm Kamala, and I think you published my great aunt. And I said, what? And she said, my great aunt is an Indian writer called Atiya Hussain. And indeed, I had, in the Virago Modern Classics series, republished her 2 books, a collection of stories, and her absolutely astonishing novel, Sunlight on a Broken Column, which I had got Anita Desai to write new introductions to. And she had been described, I found out later, by Vikram Seth and Sama Mushti as the mother of the modern Indian novel written in English. I knew nothing about her, but I loved these 2 books. And I published them, and they got pretty much no attention, I have to say. But over the years, they have become the classics that they deserve to be. So here was her great niece. And I was an agent at the time, and I gave her my card, and I said, this story that you wrote, which I loved, I think that there's a longer narrative behind it. And if you're interested in pursuing that, get in touch with me. And I was an agent, as I said, and she did get in touch with me. She said later that she just literally sat down and started writing the novel. And she was still doing her MFA. And together we worked on it, and I placed it with Granta Books, and one of the last things that her great aunt heard before she died was that her great niece's book was going to be published. And Kamala and I have worked together ever since, so we have never not been together. Nearly 30 years it's been.
And when we were talking yesterday, you talked about keeping the faith with Kamala.
Yes, well, her first novels were beautiful but very quiet. And they got some nice reviews and really no sales. And I'm quite a stubborn person, and I kept going. But it wasn't until her 5th novel, and I will never forget beginning to read that novel, and all the hairs on my arms stood up. It opened in Hiroshima with the bombings, and it then cut back to Delhi. And it was an extraordinary novel that stepped right outside of her personal experience and took on great sweeps of history and politics. And I read it with my heart in my mouth. And when I got to the end of it, I just knew that this was the book that could burst her out into the world. And indeed, the lovely thing was that my colleagues understood that too. So there was a kind of renewed energy in the company. And it was shortlisted for the Women's Prize. And so that was really the beginning of what became an incredibly successful career. But it began as a very quiet, slow burn. And I think in a way that she's grateful for the fact that she was allowed to grow at her own pace and didn't feel... I think often that for somebody to have their first novel be a huge success can be a great curse, because it's like, where do you go from there? It's a huge pressure. But if you could grow at your own pace, then you know, it's like all of us in our lives. You know, we need to have time to grow up.
Exactly, and I think that's probably true of other writers that you've published as well, right? Staying with them, knowing that maybe there was a Nobel in the works at the end of it.
Well, of course, he's here he's here at this wonderful festival, Abdulrazak Gurna. Of course, I had no idea that there was a Nobel at the end. And the thing is, that, as I was saying earlier, we none of us know. But what I did know, and I knew his work, he was halfway through his present career, not halfway through his career, because there's much more to come. But when he came to me, he had been shortlisted already for the Booker Prize. But I took him on just because I loved his work. And I felt right from the beginning that his work told us important things, but that the work did that in ways that are so subtle and meaningful, and you need to pay attention. And they are beautiful novels, and really it was the beauty of his novels as much as what he was writing about that affected me. And that for me was what mattered. It wasn't thinking it's going to happen. But on the other hand, I have to say that with the Booker Prize of the year that we published Afterlives, his most recent novel, I was absolutely sure that he would be on the long list, because for various reasons, because I think is one of his greatest novels, and all his novels are so fine, one of his most important novels. And also, just as we were talking about publishing changing, Black Lives Matters had happened, and the chair of the Booker Prize that year is a really distinguished and amazing publisher, the first black woman to start a publishing company in Britain. And I thought, it's a cinch. I literally changed the publication date. I brought it forwards by a month so it would fall in that year. And it didn't appear on the list. And it was one of the most personally disappointing moments of my entire career. But I was not to know that a few months later, the best prize was to happen. So it just goes to show that we never know anything.
True, and that's a wonderful story. If we could shift gears for a little bit, I want to ask you about some other things you've been involved in. You're a patron of of a society that studies literary censorship, right? Can you tell us a little bit about the importance of an organization and work like that in the world today? It seems like there are authoritarian regimes throughout the world. Can you speak a little bit about the freedom to write? And
I'm associated with two charities, and both of them are about freedom, but different sorts of freedom. One is a charity called Reprieve, which is an extraordinary charity that is a team of lawyers who work tirelessly to free people who are sentenced to death in different countries. It began in America and is now spread to most countries where there is the death sentence, and they literally save people's lives, which I think is an extraordinary thing. And the other charity is Index on Censorship, which was started by the writer Stephen Spender many years ago, and was started to fight against censorship of writers all around the world. And this is an incredibly important thing. It's very interesting. The subject of censorship is at the heart of everything that people do. And sadly, it's still a problem in many countries that there are regimes, there are governments that try to censor. They try to stop people talking, stop people writing. And Index has fought tirelessly against that over many, many, many decades. What is interesting now, of course, is that there is in the UK and in the US a new kind of censorship has arisen, and that is a kind of self-censorship. So whereas there is no fight against the government, that people legally can write what they want within the bounds of libel and defamation. But there is a kind of a new kind of rules that are being brought up about what people can and can't write about. And that comes out of an important thing. It's not that it's not coming out of something that matters. It is. But it is also having consequences on people's freedom to write and use their imagination in ways that they want to do it. So censorship is becoming an increasingly complicated matter. And in some ways, the censorship that is dealt by governments is a very clear wrong, just as killing people is a clear wrong. But censorship is now becoming something which is fluid and potentially has its own real dangers.
You're talking about the cancel culture and...
I am, but it's not just the cancel culture, but it comes out of that. And I published a novel 18 months ago called Tenderness, which is a novel about the life of D.H. Lawrence. And at the end of it, there is an extraordinary scene which reads almost like a transcript of the trial of Lady Chatterley's lover in 1960. So Lady Chatterley's lover, way after D.H. Lawrence had died, was published again by Penguin Books, and the head of Penguin Books was a man called Alan Lane. And the government took him to court to suppress the book. And day after day, he went into court, and people came up, and there were writers that spoke to defend the book, and writers and other people who spoke to get the book banned. And Alan Lane knew that he might have to go to prison for 4 years as a result of publishing Lady Chatterley's Lover. But he was undaunted. And in fact, they won, and they had the right to publish it. But they might easily not have won. And I feel that it's not just about writers feeling that they have to be careful about what they publish. It's about publishers. And I worry that publishers nowadays are very fearful, and they are too ready to literally throw their writers under the bus if the culture turns against them and social media turns against them. And I feel that publishers should stand by their writers.
Absolutely. It is a very tricky... It seems like there's censorship on the right, on the left, with governments, with people, and there's a lot of what's real and what's unreal with the fake news, and so you're absolutely right. It's a very tricky issue, and I'm sure we're all glad you're working on it. And so to kind of take things to the end of, not the end of your publishing career, but perhaps the next step, you are involved with a couple of new ventures, and I'd like you to talk to us about them. First about, is it Silk Road Slippers?
Yes, so I am, in my old age, are becoming entirely frivolous. Well, not entirely, but with 3 friends, all women. One is a wonderful editor called Faiza Khan, who's from Pakistan, but who worked for Bloomsbury in Delhi for some years. Another is the Sudanese journalist, Nesreen Malik. And another is the historian, Alex von Tunselman, who wrote the book about the Mountbattens and partition. And the 4 of us, are all women who have taken our work lives very, very seriously, and we care deeply about what we do. But we also discovered that we have this secret passion, and one that we didn't, because women, I think we feel that we have to appear serious to the world, don't like to admit to too much, which is that we love shopping, and we also love traveling. As Nesreen calls it, she says it is a labor of love and luggage. So we started this thing called Silk Road Slippers, and our logo is my family trademark from the 1920s. My mother's family were Berber Moroccan Jews who had caravans that went from Timbuktu to Essaouira, or Mogador as it then was, with ostrich feathers and gum arabic and spices. And so I come from a family of traders. And so the 4 of us travel, like here, and we go shopping, and we buy beautiful things, and we bring them home, and we sell them on Instagram. So it's a way of, we feel, telling stories, because objects, and a lot of these, they use, we have, embroidery and pottery and so on, that is very much about women's work and women telling stories. I was in Dakar and found these wonderful embroideries that women do after they've done their day's work in the fields. They sit together and they stitch the narratives of their lives. and I bought some of those. So it's about finding things that we love and bringing them home and getting them out into the world. But we've also, along with that, started a book club, which again is about looking beyond our shores. And so, in fact, Kamala Shamsi was, of course, our first author. And the author comes on the book. It's on Zoom, and you just buy a ticket for £5, and you meet the author, and we all talk, and people can ask questions. And then in November, we are starting writing masterclasses in Marrakesh, in a beautiful little hotel in Marrakesh. And so people who are learning to write, who want help with their writing, can come and spend time with the four of us. And each course will have one star writer who will come and be with us for 3 nights and give us their wisdom and their knowledge and share their experience. So that's my new life, which is a combination of books, stories, travel, and shopping.
I was listening to you talk about your mother, the history of the tribal journeys, and the fact that she kept a secret from you for all these years. That's prime fodder for fiction. Have you considered writing yourself?
I haven't. When I was a child, I wanted to be a writer, definitely. And I think that editors need to have something of the writer in them. But on the whole, I rather disapprove of editors writing as well, because I think that should go into their writers and the books they're working on, not into themselves. Having said that, I actually managed to hire 2 or 3 brilliant editors who were writers. I really deeply disapproved of it, but they're the best editors I've worked with.
And how many students are you accepting into your first workshop? And is it juried acceptance? How did they get in touch with you?
Well, we haven't even announced it, so you're like the first people to hear about it. We're going to announce it on social media.
Okay.
And you apply through our website. And really, it will be whoever gets there first. And 18 is the maximum, but 2 of those places will be through a scheme where they don't have to pay.
Mm-hmm.
But that's all to be announced.
That sounds incredibly exciting, and it was a joy to speak with you this afternoon, Alexandra, and also to look at the arc of your career, where you have done so well by doing good by people at every stage, and I wish you every success.
Thank you so much.